Hello and welcome to this little video where I will be beginning to talk through CMI Assignment 501, Principles of Management and Leadership in an Organizational Context. This is the first of 12 videos that I'll be putting together to walk through each of the different assessment criteria, so each component of the assignment. In this video, next few minutes, I will be just introducing the assignment in brief and talking through assessment criteria 1.1, the first one. So this is all about getting up and running. Okay, so CMI assignment 501, it's comprised of 3 tasks. So if you look at the assignment document, you'll see 3 key tasks, and associated with those 3 tasks are a total of 12 assessment criteria. So some of the tasks have quite a few. So the first task has quite a lot of assessment criteria. The last one, I think, only has the one. So a little bit varied. It's the assessment criteria that really matter. So when you're writing it, it's the assessment criteria to really pay attention to. And I recommend putting in a subheading for each different assessment criteria. So essentially the assignment would have 12 subheadings, one for each piece of assessment criteria. The total word count for the assignment is 4,400 words. That doesn't include things like subheadings, references, quotes, that type of thing. That would all be additional. But nonetheless, a lot of people find it a bit of a challenge to keep it to that word count. So writing it as efficiently as possible is part of the challenge. The first thing to do before you get into the assignment proper is to do a brief statement of context. A couple of paragraphs, not too much, no more than about 300 words. A little bit about you, your role as a manager, and what that looks like in your organization. So just a little bit about yourself. If you manage and lead people, what does that look like? You know, how many reports have you got? That type of thing. If you are in charge of process or systems, again, just a little description. So only brief and just sets the scene a little bit and introduces you and gives the reader an understanding of your role in your context. No more than 300 words, and that isn't included in the overall word count. So it doesn't burn up any words, and it doesn't need to be War and Peace. So then we can get into the assignment. We'll have a look. So the first task: write a report entitled "Principles of Management and Leadership Within an Organizational Context." So I think this is the biggest part of the assignment, actually, this first task. And assessment criteria 1 or 1.1, where it all begins, examine the impact of the legal status on the governance of an organization. The way that this is written does baffle people a little bit. It's not the easiest question to decipher. But actually what I'm going to do now is break it down and talk it through so that hopefully it all makes sense and you can see that actually not too bad what the CMI is asking us to do. So assessment criteria 1.1, examine the impact of legal status on the governance of an organization. So I think the way to begin with this is to think about your organization. So that's what I recommend, is to stick with what you know and just to think a little bit about the organization that you work in. What type of organization is it? Is it a limited company with just a small number of shareholders? Is it a listed company? Is it a charity? Is it a public sector organization? Is it an international agency or an international sort of organization made up of a coalition? You know, I know that people listening to this will work for lots of different types of organization, but the start point is, what type of organization do you work for? How would you describe it? What is that organization's legal status? And then we need to think a little bit about governance. So what do we actually mean by governance? So here's a definition. Governance encompasses the system by which an organization is controlled and operates, and the mechanisms by which it and its people are held to account. Ethics, risk management, compliance, and administration are all elements of governance. So this is really about, how does the organization work? How is it kept legal and accountable? What does that sort of what do those mechanisms look like for you? Okay, so and again, some specific examples there: ethics, risk management, compliance, and administration, governance. How is your organization governed? So, given the legal status, what does your um, decision-making process look like? How are risks managed? Do you have organizational values and that type of thing to um, steer how the organization works and how decisions are made? It could be helpful when you're just describing this, when you're describing, if you like, the governance layout of your organization, so how it works and how it's held to be accountable. Anything that you've got around policies that you could quote, yep, any references that you can bring in to support that. It could be your website, it could be, the About Us part of a website sometimes has elements of governance. Yeah, always good just to weave in any external references or sources into the discussion. I found this quite nice little image. So this is Newham Health Collaborative, .co.uk, and it's quite a nice little image to that sort of defines what governance is all about. So vision, mission, strategy, and objectives. But we've got some specific things that you could potentially choose to focus in on. So we've got the board and management committee. So again, that's kind of the power structure in the business. Your values and ethics, policies and regulatory frameworks. So are you regulated by anybody? That could be worth mentioning. Monitoring and internal controls. So again, that thing about accountability, and making sure that it's a well-run and efficient organization. Risk and performance management. So how are risks and performance managed, and transparency and accountability. So because this is ultimately word count is quite limited, you don't need to talk about all of these things, but it might be helpful to zoom in and talk about, say, 2 or 3 of these points when you're describing your organization's governance. I think, though, to really boil it down, what do we really need to talk about? What's key as part of this assignment? How are significant decisions made? I think that's a really important question to think about. So, in terms of your governance, how does your organization make significant decisions? How are risks managed? So, again, part of governance is, as we've seen, the management of risks. How does that happen in your organization? And then the key really as well, just to think about, is that third question. What impact does this have on you as a manager in the organization? So your role, how is that affected? I suppose I can talk about my own organization a little bit here. So a small limited company, there's just 2 shareholders, so decisions are made very quickly. It has quite a high appetite for risk. If both directors agree, and they are comfortable with the risk, sometimes they will seek guidance from an external specialist. So we have HR consultants, finance specialists or legal experts who might give us some guidance from a specialist perspective. So there is some risk management, which also supports how we make decisions by leaning on external specialists. But ultimately, if the 2 directors, having discussed a decision, agree, it's likely that they will go ahead, and there is a fairly high risk appetite in the business. So that's all part of it. Now, what does that mean for me as a manager in the organization? It means that if we have ideas, we can generally give it a go. We can test things out without too many barriers or obstacles, and we can make things happen pretty quickly. The downside to that is that it's quite possible that we would land on a bad idea or make a mistake or miss something in that decision-making process and actually launch a plan or a way or a strategy or an idea that just doesn't work out because there were things that we'd missed, things that we hadn't thought about. So sometimes, it's what they say, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Actually, part of how my organization works, being so small and being quite agile, every now and again, there are decisions which you think, we probably didn't get that quite right. And had we slowed down a little bit and had a little bit more rigor in our decision making, then we might have come to a better plan. So that would be my discussion on this. Just in terms of last things for this part, one thing that you can do is briefly consider comparing the governance of your organization to a different type of organization. So if I was to compare my, say, small limited company, now I used to work in the public sector, totally different. So it was public money, it was accountable to, in a very hierarchical system, it was accountable to the taxpayer and to politicians. It meant that any decision that involved any sort of spending would have to have a committee. It would have to be rigorously agreed. There'd be various different checks and key stakeholders that would need to sign off any sort of financial decision, that type of thing. So very low appetite for risk where it meant any sort of financial outlay. So completely different. And so it was an interesting thing maybe just to compare the organization that I'm in now with another type of organizational structure, again, public sector. Very different when it comes to decision making, how decisions are made and how risks are managed, but much more rigorous, much slower and far less agile. But ultimately, when you do get to a decision, it would have been run through various different lenses, and it would have been very carefully thought about. And so it's likely that the decision would be a good one, and it would be have been rigorously assessed first. So yeah, if you are listening to this and you work in a public sector organization, what you could do, and again, only briefly, maybe think about how your organization's approach to governance could be different, say, to a more agile entrepreneurial small business, something like that. What, just almost as a counterpoint, how might governance in a public sector organization differ to that small business or similar? So there we go. It's just that little bit of a counterpoint, really. And that is the first assessment criteria complete, really. So just very much in summary, a little bit about what type of organization do you work in, how would you describe it in terms of the legal status, public sector, private sector, listed organization, or a small limited company. Based on that, how does your organization approach governance? How do you make decisions and how do you manage risks? And then what does that mean for you as a manager? How does that impact on how you work and how you operate? Lastly, just briefly, a comparison with a different type of legal status organization would be a really good way to finish it off. There we go. So I hope that's been helpful. And I will be picking this up with assessment criteria 1.2.